Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we slip behind the candlelit windows of colonial Philadelphia, where Benjamin Franklin, the man on your $100 bill, kept stranger, quieter secrets than history ever taught you. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. There is a particular quality to the evening air in an old city. A heaviness, almost. The warmth of the day still rising from the cobblestones beneath your feet. The smell of bread from somewhere down the lane. The soft glow of candlelight pressing through oiled paper windows, yellow and trembling, as though the light itself is drowsy. Let yourself settle now. Let your breath slow. Let the sounds of wherever you are begin to soften and recede. We are going somewhere tonight. Not far. Not fast. We are going to a city by a river, a city of brick and mud and printing presses and argument and invention and very good beer, a city in the middle of the 18th century, when the world was on the edge of becoming something it had never quite been before. And we are going to follow one man through it. Not a king. Not a general. A printer. A man who liked to sit by the fire late at night, thinking. His name you already know. But tonight, we will try to know him differently. Part 1. The City on the Delaware. Picture, for a moment, a morning in Philadelphia in the year 1740. The sun has not yet fully risen over the rooftops of the eastern wards. The Delaware River, wide and dark and slow-moving at this hour, catches the first pale light on its surface and holds it there, trembling. A fog sits low over the water, soft as wool, and from somewhere out in the harbor comes the slow creak of a moored vessel swaying against its rope. The city is already waking. Or rather, it never fully slept. Philadelphia in the middle of the 18th century was not the oldest city in the American colonies. Boston had it by decades. Charlestown in Carolina had its own kind of heat and swagger. New York had its harbor and its hurrying merchants. But Philadelphia had something the others were still working toward. It had a feeling of intention. William Penn had laid it out, nearly 60 years earlier, with a surveyor's care and a Quaker's dream of order. The streets ran at right angles to one another, which was almost miraculous in an era when most cities had simply grown up around their own confusion. The blocks were generous. There were plans for 5 open squares, green spaces dropped into the grid like patches of breathing room, because Penn had lived through the Great Fire of London as a young man, and he understood, in his bones, what happened to a city that grew too dense, too combustible, too close. By 1740, those streets were filling in nicely. Market Street ran east to west, down to the riverfront, and on market days, which came twice a week, it hummed and jostled with farmers from the surrounding countryside who brought their cabbages and butter and live chickens in cages, and merchants who had arrived from England with bolts of cloth and boxes of spice, and servants running errands for households they would never be invited to dine in, and small boys chasing each other between the stalls, and women examining a length of ribbon. With the concentration of a philosopher examining a proof. The smells were extraordinary. Not all of them pleasant. There were open drains running down the center of many streets, and the horses and pigs and dogs that shared the city with its human inhabitants were not particularly tidy. But mixed in with all of that was the smell of fresh baked bread from the bakeries along 2nd Street, and the warm, resinous smell of sawdust from the carpenters' yards, and on certain mornings, if the wind came off the river just so, a clean salt sharpness that reminded you the ocean was not far away. The population of Philadelphia in the middle decades of the 18th century was somewhere between 12 and 15,000 souls. That number would sound modest today. But by colonial standards, it was remarkable. Philadelphia was the largest city in British North America, and one of the largest in the entire British Empire west of London. It had shipyards and glassworks and printing establishments and a nascent medical community and a thriving trade in everything from indigo to ironware. It had, in other words, all the conditions necessary for a certain kind of mind to flourish. A mind that was curious about everything. That could not look at a phenomenon, a thunderstorm, a whirlpool, a kitchen fire, an argument between neighbors, without wanting to understand the mechanism behind it. A mind that was practical enough to know that understanding, by itself, was not enough, that understanding had to be converted into something useful, something that changed the conditions of life for the better. That mind belonged to a man who had arrived in Philadelphia as a runaway boy of 17, with a Dutch dollar and a shilling's worth of copper in his pocket, and no one in the city who knew his name. His name was Benjamin Franklin. But we are not yet quite ready for him. Let us stay here a little longer, in the morning of the city. Let us walk these streets the way he walked them, when they were new to him and everything was interesting. The brick buildings along Chestnut Street were, by the standards of the colonies, genuinely impressive. 2 stories, 3 stories in some cases, with white-painted shutters and iron boot scrapers beside the front doors and the occasional potted plant on a windowsill. The city had roughly 600 buildings by the time Franklin arrived, and it was adding more every year. The taverns were a particularly important architectural feature of colonial Philadelphia. Not merely because people drank in them, though they certainly did, and with enthusiasm, but because taverns were the social infrastructure of the age. They were the places where merchants exchanged information, where travelers shared news from other cities, where political arguments were conducted, where deals were struck, where loneliness was briefly held at bay. A good tavern in colonial Philadelphia was something like a library, a stock exchange, a parliament, and a dining room all pressed into one. And then there were the churches. Philadelphia's Quaker heritage meant that meeting houses were plentiful and plain as spare, whitewashed rooms where the congregation sat in silence waiting for the Spirit to move someone to speak. But the city was also home to Presbyterians and Anglicans and Lutherans and Catholics and, in the years ahead, to whatever strange new religious enthusiasms blew through from England or stirred up out of the countryside. It was, in short, a city in motion. A city asking questions of itself. A city that was not sure, yet, what it was going to become. Which was exactly the right kind of city for Benjamin Franklin. Part 2: The Boy from Boston. There is an image that survives from the morning in October 1723 when Benjamin Franklin first arrived in Philadelphia. He wrote it himself, years later, in his autobiography, one of the most widely read memoirs in the history of American letters. And he wrote it with a dry, amused honesty that was characteristic of everything he produced. He arrived at the Market Street wharf, having crossed the Delaware from Burlington by boat. He was tired and hungry and his clothes were rumpled from the journey. He had a little money and no connections and no plan beyond the vague hope of finding work as a printer. He walked up Market Street with a roll in each hand and a third roll tucked under his arm, eating as he walked, because he was 17 years old and very hungry. He passed a young woman standing in a doorway. She watched him walk by this awkward, slightly puffed-up boy with his pockets bulging in his rolls, and she laughed at him. Her name was Deborah Red. He would eventually marry her. but that is getting ahead of things. Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston on the 17th of January, 1706, the 15th child of Josiah Franklin, a tallow chandler and soap boiler who had come from Northamptonshire in England looking for a better life. Josiah was a capable, religious, practical man. He had 17 children in total, 10 by his first wife, who died, and 7 more by Abia Folger, his second. Benjamin was the 10th son, which meant he was, in a sense, the last son, a peculiar position in a large family, neither the oldest nor the youngest, neither the heir nor the baby, but somewhere in the long middle of things. Josiah had hoped, briefly, to send Benjamin to the ministry. The boy was clearly clever. He had learned to read before he could remember not knowing how. He was quick with numbers, quick with words, quick with everything. He went to the Boston Latin School for a year, and he did well. But Josiah had 10 mouths to feed and a candle shop to run, and the ministry cost money that he did not have, and so Benjamin was pulled out of school at the age of 10 and set to work in the family business. He hated it. Not with a screaming, melodramatic hatred. Benjamin Franklin was not a screaming, melodramatic person. But with a quiet, persistent, absolutely certain knowledge that cutting candle wicks and boiling tallow was not what his mind was for. What he loved was books. He described, in his autobiography, how he spent every cent he could scrape together on books. How he read by firelight late into the night. How he traded books with other boys, reading one overnight and returning it in the morning, fresh, so the owner wouldn't know he'd had it. He read Plutarch and Bunyan and Defoe. He read whatever he could get his hands on. And he taught himself to write by a method that is, even now, worth considering. He found a copy of The Spectator, the famous English essay journal written by Addison and Steele, and he admired the prose in it enormously. He read an essay, set it aside, and then, days later, tried to reconstruct it from memory in his own words. Then he compared what he had written to the original. Where his version was inferior, where the language was less precise, less elegant, less clear, he studied the difference and tried to understand what the better writer had done that he had not. He did this over and over again. He was 12 years old. It was this quality, this willingness to identify his own deficiencies and then systematically work to correct them, that would define his life. Franklin was not a man who accepted himself as finished. He was always in revision. When he was 12, his father apprenticed him to his older brother James, who ran a printing shop in Boston and had recently started one of the first newspapers in the colonies, the New England Courant. It was an argumentative, satirical paper, and James was not afraid of controversy. He attacked the clergy, mocked the authorities, and generally made himself the kind of publisher that powerful people found extremely irritating. Benjamin worked for him, setting type and pulling proofs and doing all the physical work of the press. And he watched. And he read everything that came through the shop. And after a while, he could not stand it anymore, he wanted to write. But James would never publish his younger brother. He was condescending toward Benjamin in the way that older brothers sometimes are when younger brothers show a disconcerting tendency to be smarter than them. So Benjamin invented a character. Her name was Silence Dogood. She was a middle-aged widow, philosophical and sharp-tongued and full of opinions about the state of Boston society. She left her letters at the printing house door in the middle of the night, so no one would know who wrote them. The Silence Dogood letters were an immediate sensation. Boston loved her. James printed all 14 of them, each one wittier and more pointed than the last. Silence Dogood had things to say about education, about the treatment of women, about the pretensions of Harvard graduates, about the tyranny of fashion. When James finally discovered that his 16-year-old apprentice brother was the author, he was furious. The relationship between the brothers was, by this point, genuinely unhappy. James was physically rough with Benjamin when he was displeased. Benjamin endured it, but he was not the sort of person to endure something indefinitely. In 1723, he ran. He violated his apprenticeship contract, which was a serious matter legally, and he knew it. He could not get passage to New York on any Boston ship, because James had spread the word. He eventually found a captain willing to take him, no questions asked, and he arrived in New York after 3 days at sea, knowing no one. New York had nothing for him. A printer there sent him on to Philadelphia, where, he was told, a man named Andrew Bradford might have need of a journeyman printer. And so, on that October morning, he walked up Market Street with his rolls, and a young woman laughed at him from a doorway. He was 17 years old and entirely alone in a city he had never seen. He was also, though he could not possibly have known it yet, exactly where he needed to be. Part 3: The Printer's Trade. There is something almost meditative about a printing press in operation. Close your eyes and imagine the room. The long wooden cases of movable type, each letter in its assigned compartment, the lowercase letters nearest the compositor's hands, because they are needed most, the capitals in the uppercase, slightly farther away. The smell of ink, thick and metallic and faintly sweet. The quiet focused work of setting each tiny letter into the composing stick, one by one, building a line of text the way a mason builds a wall, letter by letter, until the line is full and must be locked into place. The physical effort of the press itself. The heavy iron screw, or the wooden beam, that must be pulled or pushed to drive the platen down against the type and the paper. The clean lift of the handle. The paper, when it comes away, covered in words that did not exist a moment ago. Franklin loved it. Not in a sentimental way. He was not a sentimental man, or not primarily. He loved printing the way a craftsman loves a trade that he is genuinely good at, with the deep, quiet satisfaction of competence. He was fast. He was accurate. He understood the whole process, from the casting of type to the binding of books, in a way that most printers understood only their own narrow part of it. And it gave him something else. It gave him access. A printer in 18th-century Philadelphia occupied a peculiar and valuable position in the social ecosystem. He was not a gentleman, not, at first, anyway. But he was not quite an ordinary tradesman either. Because he handled words, and words were power. Every pamphlet arguing for or against some proposed tax, every sermon distributed to a congregation that couldn't all fit in the church, every broadside announcing a ship's arrival or a horse race or a public hanging, all of it passed through the printer's hands before it reached anyone else. The printer was, in a sense, the nervous system of the public sphere. Franklin understood this instinctively. His first months in Philadelphia were difficult. He worked for Andrew Bradford, briefly. Then he was taken up by the provincial governor, Sir William Keith, who made him lavish promises, money to set up his own printing house, letters of introduction to London suppliers. Keith sent him to London, supposedly to purchase equipment. But the letters of credit Keith had promised never materialized. Franklin arrived in London with very little money and no support, and discovered that Sir William Keith was, in the most polite possible phrasing, a man whose promises significantly outran his ability to deliver them. Franklin spent 18 months in London. He was 19 years old. He worked in print shops along Fleet Street, good ones, larger than anything in Philadelphia. He read voraciously. He ate cheap meals in tavern common rooms and spent what he had left on books and conversation. He met printers and booksellers and writers and coffeehouse philosophers. He saw, for the first time, what a city looked like when it had fully committed to the life of the mind. London in the 1720s was the largest city in Europe. It had a population of perhaps 600,000, 40 times the size of Philadelphia. It had its own newspapers, its own debating clubs, its own coffeehouses where men gathered to argue about Newton's physics and Locke's philosophy and the proper interpretation of Virgil. It had filth and grandeur in equal and overwhelming measure. Franklin absorbed it all. He also swam in the Thames. This was not entirely unusual. The river was used for bathing, among other things, but Franklin was a particularly strong and elegant swimmer, and he attracted attention. An English nobleman's son offered to pay him to teach his household to swim. Franklin was briefly tempted to stay in London and set up as a swimming instructor, which is perhaps the most unexpected career path in the history of American greatness. He did not. In 1726, he came back to Philadelphia. And this time, he began to build something. He worked for a merchant for a while, then went back into printing. In 1728, he and a partner named Hugh Meredith set up their own printing house. Franklin was 22 years old. Within 2 years, through a combination of good work, careful management, and a canniness about reputation that was unusual in a man so young, he had bought out his partner and was running the business himself. His shop was on Market Street, a block from the Delaware waterfront, on the southern side between 2nd and 3rd. It was a modest building, 2 rooms downstairs, a composing room and a press room, with storage above. The smell of it, in summer, was almost overpowering. The ink and the linseed oil used to thin it, the damp paper hung up to dry after printing, the occasional whiff of the street outside where life proceeded with its usual lack of restraint. Franklin worked long hours. He cultivated, quite deliberately, a reputation for industriousness. He told the story himself. He would wheelbarrow loads of paper through the streets at odd hours, making sure to be seen working. He wanted Philadelphia to know that this young printer was serious and reliable. Reputation, he understood, was a form of capital that could be invested and compounded just like money. He was not wrong. In 1729, he took over the Pennsylvania Gazette, a struggling newspaper, and transformed it into something much more interesting. The Gazette under Franklin became lively, well-written, occasionally provocative, and full of the news that Philadelphians actually wanted to read. He wrote much of it himself, under various pseudonyms, in a style that was clear and plain and often quite funny. He was making a living. He was building a name. He was, in the way of a young man with a great deal of energy and not enough of it being used up by the work at hand, beginning to look around for other things to do. Other questions to ask. Other problems to solve. Part 4, The Junto and the Life of the Mind. It was a Friday evening, probably in the autumn of 1727. The candles were lit in a room above a tavern, or perhaps in a member's home, the accounts differ, somewhere in the narrow street heart of Philadelphia. A small group of young men were settling into their chairs, pulling their coats closer against the chill coming in under the door, preparing to argue. Not argue loudly. That was the rule. Benjamin Franklin had organized this group, and he had given it rules, and the most important rule was that no one was to assert anything with vehemence or heat. If you disagreed with something, you were to express your doubt, gently, and ask a question. Not a combative question. A curious one. He called the group the junto. It was a word he borrowed from a political context. A junto was a faction, a cabal, but he used it in a different spirit entirely. This junto was not plotting to take power. It was, as Franklin described it, a club for mutual improvement. The members were young tradesmen and artisans, mostly. A glazier. A shoemaker. A surveyor. A self-taught mathematician. A young clergyman of uncertain denomination. None of them were wealthy. None of them were, yet, particularly distinguished. But they were all, in some fundamental way, hungry for knowledge, for conversation, for the kind of serious engagement with ideas that their daily working lives did not provide. Franklin drew up a list of questions to guide the meetings. They were remarkable questions for a group of young tradesmen in the 1720s. Have you read any history lately? What new story have you lately heard agreeable for telling in conversation? Is there any point of morals, politics, or natural philosophy on which you would like to hear the sense of the meeting? But also, crucially, do you know of any deserving young beginner lately set up, whom it lies in the power of the junto anyway to encourage? Do you think of anything at present in which the junto may be serviceable to mankind, to their country, to their friends, or to themselves? Both kinds of question mattered to Franklin. The theoretical and the practical. The philosophical and the humanitarian. He did not, in his own mind, draw a sharp line between thinking about something and doing something about it. The point of understanding the world was to improve it. The junto met every Friday evening for nearly 40 years. Think about that for a moment. 40 years of Friday evenings, of serious conversation, of slow and patient inquiry into the nature of things and the condition of the city. The membership changed over time, as members died or moved away or rose to positions that changed their circumstances. But the group persisted, with Franklin at its center, and it became the seedbed for an extraordinary number of practical improvements in the life of Philadelphia. Because the junto was not only a conversation club. It was a kind of civic laboratory. When the members talked about the lack of a public lending library, the books they read were expensive, and most of them couldn't afford to buy everything they wanted, they did not merely lament the situation. They thought about how to solve it. Within a few years, they had established what is generally considered the first subscription library in American history, the Library Company of Philadelphia. Members pooled their resources to purchase books from London, and those books were available to any member to borrow. The Library Company eventually grew into one of the most significant intellectual institutions in colonial America. Its catalog was, by the time of the Revolution, the largest collection of books in British North America. The delegates to the Constitutional Convention in 1787 used it as their working library. Thomas Jefferson used it. John Adams used it. It started because a small group of young craftsmen sitting in a room in Philadelphia couldn't afford to buy the books they wanted to read. This was the Franklin-esque pattern: identify a problem, think about it carefully, design a solution, and then build the institution that implements the solution. Not just talk about it. Build it. The junto was also where Franklin first developed the ideas that would, eventually, lead to the University of Pennsylvania, to the first public hospital in the American colonies, to the American Philosophical Society, to improvements in street lighting and street paving and fire prevention. These things did not happen quickly. They accumulated over decades, in the way that good ideas sometimes do, slowly, patiently, one conversation and one practical step at a time. But the junto was their origin. And it is worth remembering, as you let these images settle into you, that the junto was also simply a pleasure. These were Franklin's friends. These were the men he spent Friday evenings with for the better part of his adult life in Philadelphia. The arguments were friendly. The questions were genuine. The laughter was real. Franklin was, among all his other qualities, a man who valued friendship deeply, and who worked at it with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. He wrote letters. Hundreds of them, over the course of his life, thousands, in the end. Long letters, careful letters, funny letters, affectionate letters. Letters that began with inquiries about health and the state of the crops and ended with speculations about the nature of electricity or the best design for a chimney flue. He maintained friendships across decades and distances, with people in Philadelphia and Boston and London and Paris, because he understood, in a way that not everyone does, that the life of the mind is not a solitary activity. It is a conversation. And conversations require partners. The junto gave him his first real ones. Part 5, Poor Richard and the Art of Useful Wisdom. On a cold December morning in 1732, Philadelphians walking past Franklin's print shop on Market Street might have noticed something new in the window. A small pamphlet. Thin, cheaply printed on rough paper, the kind of thing you could pick up for a few pence and fold into your coat pocket. On the cover, in large clear type, Poor Richard, an almanac for the year of Christ 1733. By Richard Saunders, Philem. There was no Richard Saunders. Franklin invented him. The almanac was a form of publication that every colonial American household used. An almanac told you the phases of the moon, the dates of fairs and court sessions, the predicted weather for each month, the times of sunrise and sunset. It was the one printed object that even the most functionally literate household could not do without. Farmers needed it. Sailors needed it. Tradesmen needed it. Franklin had been publishing an almanac for another printer since 1729. Now he was publishing his own. But he had a particular idea about what he wanted to do with the empty spaces, the blank corners and margins and the gaps between the astronomical tables where most almanac publishers stuffed nothing, or stuffed tedious verses about the months of the year. He stuffed them with proverbs. Not his own, necessarily. Franklin was a magpie of language. He collected phrases and sayings and aphorisms the way other men collected coins, from everywhere: English proverbial literature, classical sources, continental proverb collections, whatever he had read and found worth remembering. But he refined them. He polished them. He made them shorter, sharper, more memorable, more useful. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A penny saved is a penny earned. Well done is better than well said. These phrases and hundreds of others appeared in Poor Richard's almanac over the 26 years Franklin published it. Some were original coinages. Many were adaptations of older material. All of them were, in their final Franklin-esque form, distillations of practical wisdom expressed in language so clear and memorable that they lodged themselves permanently in the minds of everyone who read them. Poor Richard was an immediate success. Franklin printed 10,000 copies of the first edition, an extraordinary print run for the time and place, and sold them all. He continued selling 10,000 copies a year for the entire run of the publication. Poor Richard became, after the Bible, the most widely read publication in the American colonies. The character of Richard Saunders was part of the appeal. He was a mild-mannered, self-deprecating astrologer married to a formidable woman named Bridget, who kept threatening to burn the almanac's manuscript if he didn't make it pay. He was funny. He was warm. He was the kind of person you wanted to have a conversation with, humble enough to be approachable, wise enough to be worth listening to. Poor Richard was also, quietly, a vehicle for Franklin's deepest convictions about how to live. The almanac was addressed primarily to the middling sort: farmers, tradesmen, artisans, the self-employed, and the aspiring. The people for whom the margin between sufficiency and failure was genuinely thin. Franklin had lived in that margin himself. He knew what it felt like to have barely enough and to be always aware that barely enough could become not enough at any moment. And so his proverbs addressed the daily management of that condition with remarkable specificity. Watch the pennies. Don't buy what you don't need. Get up early and work hard. Don't borrow if you can help it. If you must borrow, repay quickly. Treat your customers honestly, because reputation is worth more than any single transaction. These were not glamorous ideas. They were not the ideas of a philosopher contemplating the good life in the abstract. They were the ideas of a man who had built a successful printing business from nothing, by applying exactly these principles over many years, and who wanted to share what he had learned with people who needed it. There was a generosity in Poor Richard that is easy to miss if you only read the famous aphorisms out of context. The almanac was not a performance of superiority. It was a gift, an attempt to pass on, in the most accessible possible form, the practical wisdom that Franklin believed could genuinely help people improve their circumstances. And the people who read it, it seems, understood that. They kept buying it. For 26 years, they kept buying it. In 1757, when he was preparing to leave for London on a diplomatic mission, Franklin wrote a final number of the almanac, a kind of valedictory edition, in which he had a character called Father Abraham recite a selection of the best Poor Richard proverbs. This piece, which he titled The Way to Wealth, was separately reprinted hundreds of times and translated into dozens of languages. It became one of the most widely distributed texts of the 18th century. A man who ran a small print shop on Market Street in Philadelphia had, by sheer force of good writing and clear thinking, put his words in the hands of people all over the world. Not a bad return on 26 years of filling in the blank spaces of an almanac. Part 6, The Man in His House. It is evening now in Philadelphia. The day's business has quieted. The Market Street stalls have been packed up and the farmers have begun the long drive back to their properties in the surrounding countryside. The taverns are filling with men who have come in from the cold, late October, let us say, the year around 1748, when Franklin is in his early 40s and has recently, at last, retired from active work in the printing trade. He is not idle. He is never idle. But he has arranged his affairs so that he no longer needs to rise before dawn and work until midnight simply to keep the business running. He has taken on a partner, David Hall, a capable Scotsman, who will run the press and pay Franklin half the profits for 18 years. This arrangement will make Franklin comfortable for the rest of his life. What he wants to do with this comfort is interesting. He wants to do science. But let us stay, for a moment, with the man in his house. The Franklin household on 2nd Street, he moved there in 1739, was a substantial and cheerful place. Deborah Red, whom he had married in 1730 in a common-law arrangement, her first husband had abandoned her and was rumored to be dead, though it was never quite confirmed, was a capable, energetic, warm-hearted woman who ran the house with efficiency and a certain magnificent domesticity. She baked. She preserved. She kept immaculate accounts of household expenditures. She managed the shop at the front of the house when Franklin was away, which would become increasingly often. Their marriage was, by the standards of the time, a successful one, though it was complicated, as marriages often are, by absence and ambition and the particular loneliness of being married to someone whose mind is usually somewhere else. Franklin was fond of Deborah. He was also often somewhere else, mentally if not physically, and she was not the kind of woman who moved easily in the intellectual circles he was increasingly comfortable in. There were children. A son, William, born before the marriage under circumstances that were never entirely clarified. Franklin acknowledged him as his own and raised him, and Deborah accepted him, and the arrangement spoke well for both of them. A son, Francis Folger Franklin, who died of smallpox at the age of 4, in 1736. The death shattered Franklin in a way he rarely allowed himself to express directly, but traces of it surface occasionally in his letters: a quiet grief, a sudden deflection from the subject. A daughter, Sarah, called Sally, born in 1743, who would become the great consistent warmth of Franklin's later domestic life. The house itself was comfortable and full of things. Franklin was a collector of books, obviously, of scientific instruments, of mechanical curiosities. He owned a glass harmonica, the instrument he invented, which produced sound by touching moistened fingers to rotating glass bowls, and which was haunting and beautiful in a way that contemporary listeners found almost supernatural. He had telescopes and magnifying glasses and electrical apparatus. He had a growing library that spilled off shelves and onto tables and chairs. He was also a careful observer of his own household environment. He was always thinking about how things could be better arranged. The fireplace, for instance. In the colonial period, fireplaces were the primary source of heat in most homes. They were also, by modern standards, extraordinarily inefficient. They sucked enormous quantities of warm air up the chimney along with the smoke, drawing cold air in through every crack and gap in the building to replace what was lost. You could have a roaring fire and still be cold if you sat more than a few feet from it. And the smoke, which should have gone up the chimney, had a maddening tendency to come back into the room on cold days when the draft reversed. Franklin thought about this for a long time. It worked significantly better than what it replaced. It used less wood and produced more warmth. It reduced the amount of smoke that came back into the room. The colonial governor was so impressed that he offered Franklin a patent and exclusive right to manufacture and profit from the invention. Franklin declined. He had a principle about this. He articulated it clearly in his autobiography: "We enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others. We should be glad to serve others by our inventions, and this we should do freely and generously." He never patented anything. Not the stove. Not the lightning rod. Not the bifocal lens. Not the flexible urinary catheter he designed for his older brother John, who suffered from kidney stones. Not any of it. The inventions were gifts. They belonged to everyone. This was an unusual position in an age when intellectual property, the idea that an invention was a form of property that its creator had a right to profit from, was just beginning to be articulated. Franklin understood the argument. He simply chose not to apply it to himself. Whether this was genuine selflessness or something more complicated, a kind of pride that transcended the commercial, a desire to be known as a philosopher rather than a manufacturer, is one of the small interesting questions that Franklin's character keeps presenting. He was not simple. He was not entirely selfless. He was human, in all the complicated and interesting ways that implies. But in his house, on a quiet October evening in 1748, with the new stove throwing its warmth into the room and a book open on the table and the sound of Deborah moving somewhere in the back of the house, there was something very close to contentment. And beyond contentment, the pleasant, restless, forward-leaning feeling of a man who knows exactly what he wants to do next. Part 7: Lightning and the Nature of Things. There is a moment that is among the most famous in the history of American science. A man standing in a field or, more probably, in an open doorway, holding a silk string attached to a kite. The kite is climbing into a dark and crackling sky. On the string, below the kite, a metal key. And then a spark. But let us come to that moment slowly. Because the kite experiment was not a sudden inspiration. It was the culmination of years of careful, patient, methodical work. And the work itself is remarkable. Franklin was transfixed. He arranged to buy Spencer's apparatus when the lecture tour was over. He also wrote to Peter Collinson, a London Quaker merchant and naturalist who corresponded with colonial intellectuals, and Collinson sent him a glass tube and an account of recent English electrical experiments. And Franklin began to work. For 5 years, 1747 to 1752, electricity was his primary intellectual obsession. He worked at it with the same intense, systematic quality he brought to everything. He ran experiments. He devised new experimental setups. He thought about what the results meant. He wrote up his findings in letters to Collinson, in clear, precise English, with the instincts of a printer who knows that language is a tool for conveying information, not for obscuring it. What Franklin discovered, and articulated with remarkable clarity, was the essential nature of electrical phenomena. Before Franklin, electricity was a mystery that was observed but not understood. People knew that amber, when rubbed, attracted lightweight objects. They knew that the Leyden jar, a device invented in Holland that could store electrical charge, could produce a powerful shock. They knew that lightning was somehow related to these phenomena. But they didn't know how. The theories were varied and confused. Franklin brought order to the confusion. He proposed that electricity was a single fluid, present in all matter, and that what we called positive and negative electrical states were simply an excess or deficiency of this fluid relative to a neutral state. When an excess in one place could equalize with a deficiency in another, electricity flowed. The spark was the equalization. This was not entirely correct in the light of modern physics. Electricity involves the movement of electrons, which are particles rather than a fluid, but the fundamental insight, that electrical phenomena involve a single entity with two states that seek equilibrium, was exactly right. And the terms positive and negative, which Franklin coined, are still the terms we use. But the greatest achievement was not theoretical. It was practical. Franklin realized that lightning was not a supernatural phenomenon. It was not God's anger. It was not a mystery. It was a very large electrical spark, produced by the same mechanism as the small sparks he was generating in his lab. And if it was electrical in nature, then it obeyed the same rules as electrical phenomena in the laboratory. Which meant, in principle, it could be managed. He proposed the lightning rod. The principle was simple. A tall pointed metal rod, erected at the highest point of a building, connected by a wire to a conductor running into the ground. Lightning, which is electrical charge seeking equalization, would preferentially strike the metal rod rather than the building itself. The charge would travel harmlessly down the wire and into the ground. The building would be undamaged. In 1752, he tested this principle and in the same year, conducted the famous kite experiment, which demonstrated definitively that lightning was electrical in nature. The kite, it should be noted, was not a spectacular stunt. It was a careful experiment. Franklin conducted it quietly, with only his son William present, and he didn't rush to announce it to the world until he was sure of what he had found. He sent the description to Collinson, who communicated it to the Royal Society of London, who published it. The reception in Europe was extraordinary. Here was a man in the colonies, not a university professor, not a member of any learned society, not a formally trained scientist of any kind, who had solved one of the most impressive puzzles in natural philosophy. Who had explained lightning. Who had provided a practical means of protection against it that could, and did, save countless buildings, ships, and lives. The Royal Society awarded him the Copley Medal, its highest honor. He was elected to the Society, an extraordinary distinction for an American tradesman. Universities in Edinburgh and Oxford gave him honorary degrees. He became, almost overnight, one of the most famous scientists in the Western world. He received this recognition with characteristic composure. He was pleased. He was also, almost immediately, on to the next thing. Because for Franklin, the electrical experiments were not an endpoint. They were a demonstration of a method of what careful observation and honest reasoning could accomplish, even without formal education, even without institutional support, even at the edge of the known world. The method was the point. And the method was, look carefully. Think honestly. Test your ideas against reality. Be willing to be wrong. And when you find something useful, give it away. Part 8, A City Improved. Let us walk through Philadelphia again. It is a summer evening, perhaps 1750. The heat of the day has not yet released the city. It rarely does in Philadelphia in July, when the air can feel almost solid with warmth and humidity, and the Delaware lies flat and glassy as a mirror in the evening light. The smell of the tidal mud exposed along the river bank mixes with the smell of horse and wood smoke and the particular sweetness of honeysuckle growing over a backyard fence somewhere nearby. You are walking along the streets that Franklin helped redesign. Not the physical streets, the cobblestones were laid by others. But the infrastructure of the streets, the things that made them safer and more civilized and more useful, bore Franklin's fingerprints everywhere. The street lamps, for instance. Philadelphia had public street lighting oil lanterns on posts, but the lanterns had a design flaw. They were globes of glass, round, with no opening at the bottom. They smoked badly. The soot deposited on the inside of the glass within a few hours of lighting, dimming the lamp until it was nearly useless. And when the light was out in the morning, the lanterns needed careful cleaning before they could be used again. Franklin noticed this. He thought about it. He designed a lantern with 4 flat glass panes and a funnel at the bottom that allowed air to circulate and carry the smoke upward rather than depositing it on the glass. His design lasted longer, burned cleaner, and required far less maintenance. It was such a small thing. A lamp design. Not a philosophical treatise. Not a political revolution. Just a better lamp. But this was what Franklin understood that many of his contemporaries did not, that civilization is made of small things. That the quality of daily life, the ease and safety and convenience of it, depends not on grand gestures but on the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 small improvements, each one addressing some specific friction, some specific difficulty, some specific way in which the world could be made a little less uncomfortable. He also helped organize Philadelphia's first professional fire company. Fire was the great terror of colonial cities. The buildings were wooden brick and plaster, heated by open flames, lit by candles. A fire that got out of control could destroy a block, a neighborhood, a whole district before it could be stopped. Boston had suffered several catastrophic fires. London had nearly been destroyed in 1666. Franklin had been thinking about fire prevention since the early 1730s. He wrote in the Gazette about the importance of chimney sweeping, about the danger of leaving hot ashes in wooden containers, about the specific behaviors and habits that increased fire risk. In 1736, the junto organized the Union Fire Company, 30 volunteers, each committed to maintaining their own equipment, 2 leather buckets, a basket, a bag for small valuables, and to responding within minutes to any fire alarm in the city. The Union Fire Company was the model for fire companies throughout the colonies. Within a few years, Philadelphia had several competing companies, each covering different neighborhoods, and the system of mutual aid and rapid response they developed was genuinely effective. Franklin was also instrumental in founding the Pennsylvania Hospital, which opened in 1751, the first hospital in British North America. The campaign to raise money for it was a masterpiece of the fundraising technique that still bears his influence. He persuaded the Pennsylvania Assembly to match private donations, creating an incentive for donors who felt their individual contribution would be doubled by the public match. It worked then. It still works now. And the Academy of Philadelphia, which he founded in 1749 and which later became the University of Pennsylvania, grew directly out of a junto discussion about the need for a practical education in the city. Not a classical education aimed at producing clergymen, but an education in mathematics, science, history, English composition, and the practical arts. An education, in other words, that would actually prepare young people for the life they were likely to lead. These institutions, the library, the hospital, the fire company, the university, the various improvements to public infrastructure, were not the work of a government. They were not mandated by any colonial authority. They were the voluntary product of a community of people who cared about their city and were willing to work together to make it better. Franklin was the catalyst for most of them. Not the sole builder, he was quick to give credit to others, and the institutions involved many hands. But he was the one who saw the need, framed the solution, built the coalition, and kept the project moving until it was real and functional and no longer needed him. He understood something profound about civic life, that the gap between a city that works and a city that doesn't work is usually not money. It is usually the absence of one or two people who are willing to identify the problem clearly and then persist through all the difficulties of actually solving it. He was willing to be those people. Over and over again, in the middle decades of the 18th century, in the growing brick and cobblestone city of Philadelphia, he was willing. Part 9: Postmaster, Diplomat, and the Wider World. There is a question that hangs quietly over the first half of Franklin's life in Philadelphia. A man of his abilities, his connections, his reputation, why did it take so long for the world outside Philadelphia to notice him? The answer is partly geographical. Philadelphia was a prosperous and significant city, but it was still a colonial city, still operating within the gravitational field of London. A printer in Philadelphia, however brilliant, was not someone that the ministers of the Crown or the directors of the great London coffeehouses necessarily thought about when they were thinking about who mattered. But there was another reason. Franklin, for much of the 1730s and 1740s, was busy. He was genuinely, thoroughly, happily busy with all of it: the printing, the junto, the experiments, the almanac, the civic projects. He did not seem to be particularly impatient to be recognized beyond the borders of Pennsylvania. What changed, gradually, was the scope of his responsibilities. In 1737, he was appointed postmaster of Philadelphia, a position that was both practical and important. The colonial postal service was a mess. Mail was irregular, unreliable, and expensive. Postmasters in various cities were often more interested in the private benefits of the position than in the actual delivery of letters. Franklin reformed it. He introduced regular postal routes, reliable schedules, reasonable rates, and night mail service on the major roads between Philadelphia and New York. He kept meticulous accounts. He made the post office profitable when it had previously been a drain on the colonial treasury. In 1753, he was appointed Deputy Postmaster General for all of British North America, a position that gave him authority over postal operations from Nova Scotia to Georgia, and that took him on inspection tours up and down the eastern seaboard that gave him, for the first time, a comprehensive picture of the whole of colonial society. He measured the roads as he traveled them. He noted the distances and conditions and the travel times. He sent back detailed reports. He was, as always, systematically accumulating information about a system that he intended to improve. And he met people. Everywhere he went, Boston, New York, Williamsburg, he met the significant men of each colony, the governors, the merchants, the lawyers, the clergy, the emerging class of colonial intellectuals who were beginning, slowly and without quite articulating it, to think of themselves as something more than Englishmen living at a distance. This broader exposure coincided with a broadening of Franklin's political engagement. He had been a member of the Pennsylvania Assembly since 1751, elected by the citizens of Philadelphia, serving without pay. Pennsylvania's politics in the 1750s were dominated by the conflict between the Assembly, which represented the colonists' elected interests, and the proprietors, the Penn family, who still owned the colony under the original charter and who insisted on their right to govern it without paying taxes on their vast landholdings. Franklin took the Assembly's side. He was good at this kind of fight, patient, strategic, always looking for the lever that would move the situation more than any direct confrontation could. He wrote pamphlets. He built coalitions. He waited for the right moment. In 1757, the Assembly sent him to London as their agent, their representative, their lobbyist, in the capital of the empire. He was to press their case against the proprietors before the Board of Trade in Parliament. He sailed in June of that year, and he would not return to Philadelphia for 5 years. London in 1757 was everything London in 1724 had been, and more. The city had continued to grow in the 30 years since Franklin's first visit. It was the nerve center of a global empire engaged in the 7 Years' War, a conflict that was being fought on 4 continents simultaneously. The coffee houses were full of intelligence and intrigue. The political world was in motion. Franklin arrived with his electrical fame already established, the Copley Medal, the honorary degrees, the papers published in the Royal Society's transactions. He was not an unknown colonial printer anymore. He was a philosopher, a man of science, a figure of genuine standing. He loved it. And London loved him. He settled into rooms in Craven Street, just off the Strand, at the home of a widow named Margaret Stevenson, whose daughter Polly became one of his most cherished correspondents. He fell easily into the intellectual life of the city, the dining clubs, the scientific societies, the parliamentary lobbying, the long evenings of conversation with men who thought deeply about the same things he thought about. He was happy in London in a way that he was also happy in Philadelphia, but differently. In Philadelphia, he was the builder, the man whose energy and vision made things happen. In London, he was the guest, the observer, the colonial curiosity who turned out to be much more interesting than expected. Both roles suited him, in their different ways. But throughout the London years, and there would be 2 long missions, 1757 to 1762, and then again 1764 to 1775, there was a growing tension that Franklin felt in his bones long before he could fully articulate it. The question of what the colonies were, and what they had a right to be. That question was not yet a crisis in 1757. It was barely a question yet. But it was forming, in the minds of thoughtful men on both sides of the Atlantic, and Franklin was one of the first people to feel its outlines. Part 10, The Question of Liberty. It is 1765. London. A long afternoon in a coffee house somewhere near Parliament. The windows are fogged with condensation, the air inside thick with the smell of tobacco and coffee and wet wool. The newspapers are spread on the tables, several papers, because there were several papers in London by this point, each with its own politics and its own angle on the news of the day. And the news of the day, in the spring of 1765, is the Stamp Act. Parliament has passed a tax on paper, specifically, on every piece of printed paper used in the American colonies. Newspapers. Legal documents. Pamphlets. Even playing cards. All of it to be stamped with an official mark confirming that the tax has been paid. The revenue raised is to help pay for the British military forces stationed in America, forces deployed in part to defend the colonies after the French and Indian War. The British government sees this as perfectly reasonable. The colonies benefited from the protection. They should contribute to its cost. The colonies do not see it this way. No taxation without representation. The phrase is not Franklin's, but the idea runs through everything he is writing and saying in this period. Franklin's position in 1765 was, in retrospect, a transitional one. He was a loyal subject of the Crown. He had spent years in London cultivating relationships with members of Parliament, with ministers, with officials at every level of the imperial government. He genuinely believed, in his early London years, that the difficulties between Parliament and the colonies could be resolved through negotiation, through persuasion, through the patient application of good arguments. He did not believe, not yet, in independence. He testified before Parliament against the Stamp Act with characteristic brilliance. The testimony was a tour de force of clear, calm, relentless logic, answering hostile questions with precision, turning each attempt to trap him into an opportunity to make a point. He explained the colonial objections. He explained the economic consequences of the tax. He explained why enforcement would be difficult and expensive. He explained, in terms that even the most skeptical member of Parliament could follow, why the policy was both unjust and self-defeating. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. Franklin was celebrated in the colonies as a hero. His portrait was printed and hung in homes from Boston to Savannah. He was the man who had gone to London and made the empire listen. But Parliament, in the same legislation that repealed the Stamp Act, passed the Declaratory Act affirming that Parliament had the right to make laws binding on the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The argument was not over. It was barely beginning. The decade between 1765 and 1775 was the decade in which Benjamin Franklin changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was not a conversion experience. It was the slow, grinding realization of a man who had spent years believing in the good faith of the British government, that the good faith was not there. That the ministers who smiled at him in drawing rooms and spoke of accommodation and reasonableness were not, in fact, prepared to accommodate anything significant or treat the colonists as anything other than subjects to be managed. Franklin sat through the attack in complete stillness. He was 68 years old. He was wearing, according to contemporary accounts, a suit of Manchester velvet, a practical, slightly defiant choice of cloth from the English industrial city rather than anything from the genteel London trade. He gave nothing away. His face showed nothing. He would say, much later, that it was that morning in the Privy Council chamber that finally convinced him that the breach between the colonies and the Crown was not something that could be healed. He continued to try, through 1774 and into 1775. He met with Quaker mediators. He proposed a series of compromise plans. He wrote letters, gave interviews, argued through intermediaries. He was, and this is a quality of his character that it is important to appreciate, genuinely reluctant. Reluctant to give up on the possibility of a peaceable outcome. Reluctant to push the crisis to a point of no return. He sailed in mid-March and arrived in Philadelphia on May 5, 1775. 2 weeks earlier, at Lexington and Concord, the first shots of the American Revolution had been fired. The next day, the Pennsylvania Assembly elected him a delegate to the Second Continental Congress. He was 69 years old. He was the oldest member of the Congress by a wide margin. He was tired from the voyage. He was, in all probability, also in some quiet private way heartbroken for the empire he had believed in, for the possibility of reconciliation that was now definitively gone. He sat quietly in the Congress. He said relatively little. He voted. And he worked, as he always worked, on the practical problems in front of him. Part 11, The Philosopher in the Storm. There is a portrait of Benjamin Franklin that hangs now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It was painted around 1767 by David Martin, a Scottish portraitist working in London. Franklin is seated at a table, one hand resting lightly on a book, the other arm relaxed. He is wearing spectacles, the bifocal spectacles he invented, because he was tired of switching between two pairs. His expression is difficult to characterize. It is composed, certainly. It is intelligent. But there is something in it that is harder to name, a quality of patience, perhaps, or of deep private amusement at something only he can see. It is the face of a man who has been paying very close attention for a very long time, and who has drawn conclusions. By the time the revolution came in earnest, Franklin was not primarily a man of action. He was never that, in the military sense. He was a man of thought and conversation and strategic patience. And those qualities, which had seemed almost comically unsuited to an era of muskets and bayonets, turned out to be exactly what the American cause needed most. Because the question of the revolution was not only a military question. It was a diplomatic one. The Continental Army, under Washington, could fight the British to a standstill, perhaps. It could make the war expensive. It could hold territory and survive. But it could not, on its own, defeat the world's most powerful military establishment. To do that, it needed allies. It needed France. Franklin went to France in December 1776. He was 70 years old. He crossed the Atlantic in winter on a small ship, sleeping in a bunk barely long enough for his frame, the weather rough enough that water came in through the portholes and had to be bailed regularly. He spent much of the voyage taking the temperature of the seawater with a thermometer and recording it in a notebook, contributing to what would eventually become a detailed map of the Gulf Stream. Even on a winter crossing in the middle of a revolution, he was doing science. His arrival in France was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable celebrity entrances in the history of diplomacy. France in the 1770s was in the late stages of what historians would later call the Enlightenment, that long conversation between philosophers and scientists and poets and politicians about the nature of reason, the rights of individuals, the proper relationship between government and the governed. Franklin was not merely a diplomat to the French intellectual world. He was a symbol. He was the natural man, the philosopher-scientist risen from the wilderness of America, uncorrupted by European decadence, wearing a plain coat and a fur hat instead of a powdered wig, speaking plain truth in plain language. He was everything the philosophes had theorized about, and now, here he was, in person, and he was charming and funny and brilliant and old enough to be everyone's grandfather. The French went mad for him. His portrait was printed on medallions, on snuffbox lids, on rings, on teacups, on fans. Women had their hair styled to imitate his fur hat. King Louis XVI, presented with so many Franklin medallions by his courtiers, had one set into the bottom of a chamber pot as a subtle indication of his feelings about the whole thing. Franklin understood the value of the celebrity and used it. He wore his plain coat and his fur hat not because he was unaware of what he was doing, but because he knew exactly what he was doing. He was performing the role that France needed him to perform, and the performance was not entirely dishonest. He was genuinely a man of simple tastes and plain speech. He just was also, simultaneously, a man of exquisite social intelligence who understood when simplicity was a power play. The real work of the French mission was slow and delicate and often maddening. France was willing to help the American cause, it was always willing to embarrass England when the opportunity presented itself, but it was not willing to commit to open war with Britain until it was reasonably confident the Americans could win, or at least fight well enough to make French intervention decisive rather than merely expensive. Franklin maintained the alliance through a combination of personal charm, strategic patience, and the production of a nearly continuous stream of letters, memoranda, requests, arguments, and formal diplomatic documents. He managed difficult relationships with his fellow American commissioners, Silas Deane, who was politically unreliable, and Arthur Lee, who was paranoid and chronically suspicious of Franklin himself. He dealt with British secret agents who were constantly trying to cultivate informers in his household. And he waited. The news of Saratoga, the stunning American victory of October 1777, in which a British army of 6,000 men surrendered in the forests of upstate New York, arrived in Paris in early December. It changed everything. Franklin had been waiting for exactly this moment. He moved immediately. Within weeks, the French had agreed to a formal alliance. The treaty was signed in February 1778. France was at war with Britain. The American Revolution had become a world war, and the most powerful navy in the world was now fighting on the American side. This was Franklin's greatest diplomatic achievement. And it is not an exaggeration to say that without it, the war might not have ended when it did, or how it did. He remained in France throughout the war and into the peace. He negotiated the Treaty of Paris of 1783 along with John Adams and John Jay, a treaty that secured for the new United States not merely independence but the entire territory east of the Mississippi, a vast windfall of land that was far more than Britain had originally been prepared to concede. He was 77 years old when the treaty was signed. He had been away from Philadelphia for 9 years. He wanted to go home. Part 12, The Final Season. Philadelphia again. It is September 1785. The city has changed in the 9 years since Franklin left, or rather, the world around it has changed so thoroughly that even the familiar streets feel different. The cobblestones are the same. The Delaware is the same, wide and slow and catching the evening light the way it always has. But there is something new in the air. This is a republic now. The first modern republic in the Western Hemisphere. A country that has declared itself to be something genuinely new in the history of governance, a nation not built around the hereditary authority of a king, but around the principle that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Franklin arrived home to a reception that moved him genuinely. Cannon fired a salute. Crowds gathered at the wharf. The Pennsylvania Assembly formally welcomed him. He was the most famous American alive, more famous even than Washington, to the broader international world, because Washington was a general and generals were familiar, but Franklin was something rarer and stranger, a philosopher who had helped birth a nation. He was 79 years old. He was in pain. The kidney stones that had troubled him intermittently for years had grown worse during the ocean crossing. He would spend much of his remaining time in some degree of physical discomfort, sometimes manageable, sometimes not. He took laudanum, the tincture of opium that was the primary painkiller of the age, with the matter-of-fact pragmatism he brought to all difficulties. He noted the doses in his journal with the same careful hand he used to note barometric pressure and the temperature of the Gulf Stream. But he was home. He moved into the house on Market Street, expanded now, a new dining room added to accommodate the large parties he liked to give, and he settled in, as much as a man of his temperament could settle, to the final season of his life. It was not a quiet season. Almost immediately, he was drawn back into public life. Pennsylvania elected him its president, the equivalent of governor, under the new state constitution, a position he held for 3 terms. The work was administrative and political, and he brought to it the same patient efficiency he brought to everything. He mediated between factions. He managed appointments. He helped stabilize the young state's finances. And in the summer of 1787, at the age of 81, he walked the short distance from his home on Market Street to the Pennsylvania State House, the building we now call Independence Hall, to take his seat as Pennsylvania's delegate to the Constitutional Convention. He was by far the oldest delegate. James Madison was 36. Alexander Hamilton was 32. Washington, presiding over the convention with the grave authority that only Washington could bring to a room, was 55. Franklin was more than a generation older than most of the men in that chamber, and in some cases 2 generations. His contribution to the convention is sometimes underestimated because he was not one of its primary architects. Madison and Hamilton and Wilson and Gouverneur Morris did the heavy intellectual lifting of drafting the Constitution. Franklin did not design the document, but he may have saved it. There was a moment in late June 1787 when the convention was on the verge of collapse. The small states and the large states could not agree on representation. The delegates from Connecticut and New Jersey and Delaware were threatening to walk out. The temperature in the chamber was 90 degrees. The arguments had been running for weeks without resolution. Men who had fought a revolution together were barely speaking to one another. Franklin rose, or rather, was helped to rise, and asked to speak. He spoke briefly, because he could not speak at length. He reminded the assembled delegates that they were human beings attempting something that no one had successfully done before, designing a government for a free people from first principles. He suggested that if they could not agree on anything, it might be because God was not in their deliberations, and he moved that the convention open each day's session with a prayer. The motion was not adopted. There was no money to pay a chaplain, someone pointed out, with a practicality that Franklin would have appreciated. But something shifted in the room. The tone changed. Men who had been shouting, or the 18th century equivalent of shouting, found it possible to listen again. The Connecticut Compromise was reached within weeks. Small states and large states got what they needed. The convention moved forward. On September 17, 1787, when the Constitution was ready for signing, Franklin asked James Wilson to read one final speech on his behalf. It was a short speech. It was, characteristically, a speech about doubt, about the limits of human knowledge and the impossibility of certainty in political affairs. He said that he had many doubts about this Constitution. He said he expected to doubt it more when he got home and slept on it. But, he said, he consented to it because he was not sure his doubts were right. Because no assembly of men could produce a perfect document. Because the older he got, the more often he had found himself wrong about things he had been certain of. Because a constitution you doubted but could live with was infinitely preferable to no constitution at all. He asked every delegate who still had objections to doubt, as he did, the perfection of his own opinion, and to sign. All but 3 did. It was a remarkable piece of rhetoric for a man of 81 who was sitting in a hot room in pain. It was also, like everything Franklin did, exactly the right argument for exactly the right moment. Not a grand vision. Not a soaring declaration. Just a wise old man asking his colleagues to be humble about what they didn't know. As the other delegates filed up to sign, Franklin reportedly looked at the carved sun on the back of Washington's chair. The painting was partly obscured and he had spent months wondering whether it was a rising sun or a setting sun, and said that now, at last, he knew it was a rising sun. He walked home slowly through the September streets of Philadelphia. He did not know it then, but he had made his last major public appearance. There was one more. In February 1790, just 2 months before his death, he signed a petition to Congress from the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, of which he was president, calling for the abolition of slavery and the slave trade. It was his last public act. He had held slaves himself, earlier in his life, too, whose names were Peter and King. He had freed them, eventually, and come to regard the institution of slavery with the same analytical eye he turned on everything else, arriving, late but unequivocally, at the conclusion that it was wrong. Not just inefficient, not just politically inconvenient, morally wrong, a fundamental violation of the principles that the Republic had declared itself founded upon. The petition was tabled by Congress, which was not yet ready to hear it. But it was submitted. The record was made. He died on the 17th of April, 1790, at 11 o'clock in the evening, in his bed at the house on Market Street. He was 84 years old. 20,000 people attended his funeral, a fifth of the entire population of Philadelphia. It was, at that point, the largest public funeral in American history. His epitaph, which he had written for himself as a young printer in his 20s, was never used on his actual grave. He was buried simply, under a plain stone that read Benjamin and Deborah Franklin. But the self-written epitaph has survived, and it is worth hearing in full. He wrote, "The body of B. A. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out, and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here food for worms. But the work shall not be lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more, in a new and more elegant edition, revised and corrected by the author." He wrote that in his 20s. He had no idea, then, what the work would be. He only knew that there was work, and that it would continue. And he was right. Closing meditation. Let the city grow quiet now around you. Let the cobblestones cool under the weight of the night. Let the candles in the windows dim, one by one, as households settle and the day finally releases its hold on the world. Somewhere along Market Street, in the soft darkness of a Philadelphia night in the 18th century, a printing press sits still in a dim room. The ink has dried on the last sheets hung up to dry. The type has been cleaned and returned to its cases. The day's words are finished. And somewhere nearby, in a house with a warm stove of his own designing, a man with spectacles and a comfortable coat is reading by candlelight. Or perhaps writing. Perhaps just thinking, the way he loved to think, slowly, carefully, following an idea through all its implications the way you might follow a river through unfamiliar country, not knowing quite where it will take you, but trusting that it will take you somewhere worth being. He was not a perfect man. None of the great ones are. He was sometimes vain. He was sometimes calculating. He was capable of manipulation as well as generosity, of self-promotion as well as self-sacrifice. He was absent, often, from the people who loved him most. He was more comfortable in the coffee house than in the nursery. But he was also a man who got up every morning and asked, genuinely and with the full force of his considerable intelligence, "What can I understand today that I did not understand yesterday? What can I build that does not yet exist? What can I improve? What can I give away?" And he kept asking, for 84 years. Let those questions settle into you now, gently, the way good questions do, not demanding an answer, just resting there, keeping the mind company in the quiet. Let your body grow heavy. Let the weight of your arms and legs press down into whatever is beneath you. Let your breathing slow to the rhythm of a river at night, wide and unhurried and very deep. The city outside has gone dark. The press is still. The letters wait patiently in their cases for morning. And you are here, warm and resting, and the long day is done. Let the last candle go out now. Let yourself drift. There is nothing you need to do. Nothing you need to understand. Nothing you need to improve or build or figure out, not tonight. Tonight, you only need to rest. The river moves in the dark. The stars are very bright over Philadelphia, over the rooftops and the church spires and the quiet print shops and the library full of borrowed books. Sleep now. Sleep. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.